If you fill a balloon with helium, a substance lighter than the nitrogen, oxygen, and other elements which compose the air around it, the balloon will immediately fly upwards. If you fill a balloon with hydrogen, a substance even lighter than helium, the balloon will fly upwards even faster. If you blow a dandelion seed out of your hands, a substance just barely heavier than the air, it will float away and slowly but eventually fall to the ground. And if you drop an anvil from your hands, something much heavier than the air, it will quickly and directly fall straight to the ground. Now this has absolutely nothing to do with gravity. The fact that light things rise up and heavy things fall down is simply a natural property of weight and density. That is very different from gravity. Gravity is a hypothetical magnetic-like force possessed by large masses which Isaac Newton needed to help explain the heliocentric theory of the universe. Lady Blunt says, most people in England have either read or heard that Sir Isaac Newton's theory of gravitation was originated by his seeing an apple fall to the earth from a tree in his garden. Persons gifted with ordinary common sense would say that the apple fell down to earth because, bulk for bulk, it was heavier than the surrounding air. But if, instead of the apple, a fluffy feather had been detached from the tree, a breeze would probably have sent the feather floating away, and the feather would not reach the earth until the surrounding air became so still that, by virtue of its own density, the feather would fall to the ground. Wilbur Voliva, a famous flat-earther in the early 20th century, gave lectures all over America against Newtonian astronomy. He would begin by walking on stage with a book, a balloon, a feather, and a brick, and ask the audience, how is it that a law of gravitation can pull up a toy balloon and cannot put up a brick? I throw up this book, why doesn't it go on up? That book went up as far as the force behind it forced it, and it fell because it was heavier than the air, and that is the only reason. I cut the string of a toy balloon. It rises, gets to a certain height, and then it begins to settle. I take this brick and a feather. I blow the feather. Yonder it goes. Finally, it begins to settle and comes down. This brick goes up as far as the force forces it, and then it comes down because it is heavier than the air. That is all. David Wardlaw Scott says, any object which is heavier than the air, and which is unsupported, has a natural tendency to fall by its own weight. Newton's famous apple at Woolsthorpe, or any other apple when ripe, loses hold of its stalk, and being heavier than the air, drops as a matter of necessity to the ground, totally irrespective of any attraction of the earth. For if such attraction existed, why does not the earth attract the rising smoke, which is not nearly so heavy as the apple? The answer is simple. Because the smoke is lighter than the air, and therefore does not fall but ascends. Gravitation is only a subterfuge employed by Newton in his attempt to prove that the earth revolves around the sun, and the quicker it is relegated to the tomb of all the Capulets, the better will it be for all classes of society. Thomas Winship says, the law of gravitation is said by the advocates of the Newtonian system of astronomy to be the greatest discovery of science, and the foundation of the whole of modern astronomy. If, therefore, it can be shown that gravitation is a pure assumption and an imagination of the mind only, that it has no existence outside of the brains of its expounders and advocates, the whole of the hypothesis of this modern so-called science fall to the ground as flat as the surface of the ocean, and this most exact of all sciences, this wonderful feat of the intellect, becomes at once the most ridiculous superstition and the most gigantic imposture to which ignorance and credulity could ever be exposed. Einstein's theory of relativity and the entire heliocentric model of the universe hinge upon Newton's law of gravitation. Heliocentrists claim that the sun is the most massive object in the heavens, more massive even than the earth, and therefore the earth and other planets, by law, are caught up in the sun's gravity and forced to orbit perpetual circles and ellipses around it. They claim that gravity also somehow allows people, buildings, the oceans, and all of nature to exist on the underside of their ball Earth without falling off. Now, even if gravity did exist, why would it cause both planets to orbit the sun and people to stick to the Earth? Gravity should either cause people to float in suspended circular orbits around the Earth, or it should cause the Earth to be pulled and crashed into the sun. What sort of magic is gravity that it can glue people's feet to the ball Earth while causing Earth itself to revolve ellipses around the sun? The two effects are very different, yet the same cause is attributed to both. Furthermore, This magnetic-like attraction of massive objects gravity is purported to have can be found nowhere in the natural world. There is no example in nature of a massive sphere or any other shaped object, which, by virtue of its mass alone, causes smaller objects to stick to or orbit around it. There is nothing on Earth massive enough that it can be shown to cause even a dust bunny to stick to or orbit around it. Try spinning a wet tennis ball or any other spherical object with smaller things placed on its surface, and you will find that everything falls or flies off and nothing sticks to or orbits around it. To claim the existence of a physical law without a single practical evidential example is hearsay, not science. Lady Blunt and Albert Smith wrote, "That bodies in some instances are seen to approach each other is a fact, but that their mutual approach is due to an attraction or pulling process on the part of these bodies is, after all, a mere theory. Hypotheses may sometimes be admissible, but when they are invented to support other hypotheses, they are not only to be doubted, but discredited and discarded. The hypothesis of a universal force called gravitation is based upon, and was indeed invented with a view to support another hypothesis, namely that the earth and sea together make up a vast globe whirling away through space, and therefore needing some force or forces to guide it in its mad career, and so control it as to make it conform to what is called its annual orbit around the sun. The theory, first of all, makes the earth to be a globe, then not a perfect globe, but an oblate spheroid, flattened at the poles, then more oblate, until it was in danger of becoming so flattened that it would be like a cheese, and passing over minor variations of form, we are finally told that the earth is pear-shaped, and that the ellipsoid has been replaced by an apoid. What shape it may assume next, we cannot tell. It will depend upon the whim or fancy of some astute and speculating scientist. How is it that gravity is so strong that it can hold all the oceans, buildings, and people stuck to the underside of the ball Earth, but so weak that it allows birds, bugs, smoke, and balloons to casually evade its grips completely? How is it that gravity holds our bodies clung to the underside of a ball Earth, but yet we can easily raise our legs and arms, walk or jump, and feel no such constant downward pulling force? How is it that gravity can cause planets to revolve elliptical orbits around a single center of attraction? Ellipses by nature require two foci, and the force of gravitation would have to regularly increase and decrease to keep planets in constant orbit and prevent pulling them into direct collision courses. Thomas Winship says that the sun's path is an exact circle for only about 4 periods in a year, and then of only a few hours at the equinoxes and solstices, completely disproves the might have been of circular gravitation, and by consequence all of gravitation. If the sun were of sufficient power to retain the earth in its orbit when nearest the sun, when the earth arrived at that part of its elliptical path farthest from the sun, the attractive force, unless very greatly increased, would be utterly incapable of preventing the earth rushing away into space in a right line forever, as astronomers say. On the other hand, it is equally clear that if the sun's attraction were just sufficient to keep the earth in its proper path when farthest from the sun, and thus to prevent it rushing off into space, the same power of attraction when the earth was nearest the sun would be so much greater that, unless the attraction were very greatly diminished, nothing would prevent the earth rushing towards and being absorbed by the sun, there being no counterbalancing focus to prevent such a catastrophe. As astronomy makes no reference to the increase and diminution of the attractive force of the sun, called gravitation, for the above necessary purposes, we are again forced to the conclusion that the great discovery of which astronomers are so proud is absolutely non-existent. And N. Crossland says, "We are asked by the Newtonian to believe that the action of gravitation, which we can easily overcome by the slightest exercise of volition in raising a hand or foot, is so overwhelmingly violent when we lose our balance and fall a distance of a few feet, that this force, which is imperceptible under usual conditions, may, under extraordinary circumstances, cause the fracture of every limb we possess. Common sense must reject this interpretation. Gravitation does not furnish a satisfactory explanation of the phenomena here described, whereas the definition of weight already given does. for a body seeking in the readiest manner its level of stability would produce precisely the result experienced. If the influence which kept us securely attached to this earth were identical with that which is powerful enough to disturb a distant planet in its orbit, we should be more immediately conscious of its masterful presence and potency, whereas this influence is so impotent in the very spot where it is supposed to be most dominant that we find an insurmountable difficulty in accepting the idea of its existence. Heliocentrists claim the ball Earth is perpetually spinning on its axis at a mind-numbing 1,038 miles per hour, or 19 miles per second, and somehow people, animals, buildings, oceans, and other surface phenomena can stick to the underside of the spinning ball without falling or flying off. Take a ride on the Gravitron at your local amusement park, however, and notice how the faster it spins, the more you are pushed away from the center of spin, not towards it. Even if the centripetal, inward-pulling force of gravity did exist, which it does not, the centrifugal, outward-pushing force of the ball Earth's supposed 19-mile-per-second spin would also exist and have to be overcome, yet neither of these opposing forces have ever been shown to have any existence outside the imaginations of heliocentric scientists. David Wardlaw Scott says, "We are not like flies which, by the peculiar formation of their feet, can crawl on a ball, but we are human beings who require a plane surface on which to walk, and how could we be fastened to the earth whirling, according to your theory, around the sun, at the rate of 19 miles per second? The famed law of gravitation will not avail, though we are told that we have 15 pounds of atmosphere pressing on every square inch of our bodies, but this does not appear to be particularly logical, for there are many athletes who can leap nearly their own height and run a mile in less than 5 minutes, which they could not possibly do if they were thus handicapped." And Crossland says, "The attraction of gravitation is said to be stronger at the surface of the earth than at a distance from it. Is it so? If I spring upwards perpendicularly, I cannot with all my might ascend more than 4 feet from the ground. But if I jump in a curve with a low trajectory, keeping my highest elevation about 3 feet, I might clear a bound of space above the earth of about 18 feet, so that practically I can overcome the so-called force, pull, at the distance of 4 feet in the proportion of 18 to 4, being the very reverse of what I ought to be able to do according to the Newtonian hypothesis." Newton also theorized, and it is now commonly taught, that the Earth's ocean tides are caused by gravitational lunar attraction. If the Moon is only 2,160 miles in diameter, and the Earth 8,000 miles, however, using their own math and law, it follows that the Earth is 87 times more massive, and therefore the larger body should attract the smaller to it, and not the other way around. If the Earth's greater gravity is what keeps the Moon in orbit, it is impossible for the Moon's lesser gravity to supersede the Earth's gravity at Earth's sea level, where its gravitational attraction would even further out-trump the Moon's. Not to mention the velocity and path of the Moon are uniform, and should therefore exert a uniform influence on the Earth's tides, when in actuality the Earth's tides vary greatly. Furthermore, if ocean tides are caused by Moon's gravitation, how is it that lakes, ponds, and other smaller bodies of standing water remain outside the Moon's grasp, while the gigantic oceans are so affected? Thomas Winship says, "If the Moon lifted up the water, it is evident that near the land the water would be drawn away and low instead of high tide caused. Again, the velocity and path of the Moon are uniform, and it follows that if she exerted any influence on the Earth, that influence could only be a uniform influence. But the tides are not uniform. At Port Natal, the rise and fall is about 6 feet, while at Beira, about 600 miles up the coast, the rise and fall is 26 feet. This effectually settles the matter that the Moon has no influence on the tides. Tides are caused by the gentle and gradual rise and fall of the earth on the bosom of the mighty deep. In inland lakes there are no tides, which also proves that the Moon cannot attract either the earth or water to cause tides, but the fact that the basin of the lake is on the earth, which rests on the waters of the deep, shows that no tides are possible, as the waters of the lakes together with the earth rise and fall, and thus the tides at the coast are caused, while there are no tides on waters unconnected with the sea." Samuel Rowbotham says, "It is affirmed that the intensity of attraction increases with proximity and vice versa. How then, when the waters are drawn up by the moon from their bed and away from the Earth's attraction, which at that greater distance from the center is considerably diminished, while that of the moon is proportionally increased, how is it possible that all the waters acted on should be prevented leaving the Earth and flying away to the moon? If the moon has power of attraction sufficient to lift the waters of Earth at all, even a single inch from their deepest receptacles, where the Earth's attraction is much greater, there is nothing in the theory of attraction of gravitation to prevent her taking to herself all the waters which came within her influence. Let the smaller body once overcome the power of the larger, and the power of the smaller becomes greater than when it first operated, because the matter acted on is nearer to it. Proximity is greater, and therefore power is greater. How then can the waters of the ocean immediately underneath the moon flow towards the shores, and so cause a flood tide? Water flows, it is said, through the law of gravity or attraction of the Earth's center. Is it possible then for the moon, having once overcome the power of the Earth, to let go her hold upon the waters through the influence of a power which she has conquered, and which therefore is less than her own? The above and other difficulties which exist in connection with the explanation of the tides afforded by the Newtonian system have led many, including Sir Isaac Newton himself, to admit that such explanation is the least satisfactory portion of the theory of gravitation. Thus we have been carried forward by the sheer force of evidence to the conclusion that the tides of the sea do not arise from the attraction of the moon, but simply from the rising and falling of the floating earth in the waters of the great deep. That calmness which is found to exist at the bottom of the great seas could not possibly be if the waters were alternately raised by the moon and pulled down by the earth. David Wardlaw Scott says, even Sir Isaac Newton himself confessed that the explanation of moon's action on the tides was the least satisfactory part of his theory. This theory asserts that the larger objects attract the smaller, and the mass of the moon being reckoned as only 1/8 of that of the earth, it follows that if, by the presumed force of gravitation, the earth revolves around the sun, much more for the same reason should the moon do so likewise, instead of which that willful orb still continues to go round our world. Tides vary greatly in height, owing chiefly to the different configurations of the adjoining lands. At Chepstow it rises to 60 feet, at Portishead to 50, while at Dublin Bay it is but 12, and at Wexford only 5 feet. That the earth itself has a slight tremulous motion may be seen in the movement of the spirit level, even when fixed as steadily as possible, and that the sea has a fluctuation may be witnessed by the oscillation of an anchored ship in the calmest day of summer. By what means the tides are so regularly affected is at present only conjectured. Possibly it may be by atmospheric pressure on the waters of the great deep, and perhaps even the moon itself, as suggested by the late Dr. Robotham, may influence the atmosphere, increasing or diminishing its barometric pressure, and indirectly the rise and fall of earth in the waters. Samuel Robotham says, bearing this fact in mind that there exists a continual pressure of the atmosphere upon the earth, and associating it with the fact that the earth is a vast plain stretched out upon the waters, and it will be seen that it must of necessity slightly fluctuate or slowly rise and fall in the water. As by the action of the atmosphere the earth is slowly depressed, the water moves towards the receding shore and produces the flood tide, and when by the reaction of the resisting ocean medium the earth gradually ascends and the waters recede, and the ebb tide is produced. This is the general cause of tides. Whatever peculiarities are observed, they may be traced to the reaction of channels, bays, headlands, and other local causes. That the earth has a vibratory or tremulous motion, such as must necessarily belong to a floating and fluctuating structure, is abundantly proved by the experience of astronomers and surveyors. If a delicate spirit level be firmly placed upon a rock or upon the most solid foundation which it is possible to construct, the very curious phenomenon will be observed of constant change in the position of the air bubble. However carefully the level may be adjusted and the instrument protected from the atmosphere, the bubble will not maintain its position many seconds together. A somewhat similar influence has been noticed in astronomical observatories, where instruments of the best construction and placed in the most approved positions cannot always be relied upon without occasional readjustment. In the past several decades, NASA has shown video of astronauts supposedly in low Earth orbit experiencing complete weightlessness or zero gravity. How is this weightless effect achieved if gravity doesn't exist? As it turns out, for the past several decades, NASA, together with Boeing, have been perfecting so-called zero-G planes and zero-G maneuvers, which are able to produce weightlessness at any altitude. Aboard modified Boeing 727s, specially trained pilots perform aerobatic maneuvers known as parabolas. Planes climb with a pitch angle of 45 degrees using engine thrust and elevator controls. Then, when maximum height is reached, the craft is pointed downward at high speed. The period of weightlessness begins while ascending and lasts all the way up and over the parabola until reaching a downward pitch angle of 30 degrees, at which point the maneuver is repeated. Therefore, all NASA's footage of astronauts aboard space shuttles or the International Space Station can be easily hoaxed and simulated. Without gravity, the Earth and planets cannot be revolving around the Sun. Without Newtonian gravitation, Einsteinian relativity, Copernican heliocentricity, and the entire Big Bang Ball-Earth mythos cannot exist and falls to pieces. Gravity, both metaphorically and quite literally, just does not hold any water. Not as a sound theory of cosmology, and not as a law supposedly responsible for holding in the world's oceans. William Carpenter says, "Man's experience tells him that he is not constructed like the flies that can live and move upon the ceiling of a room with as much safety as on the floor, and since the modern theory of a planetary Earth necessitates a crowd of theories to keep company with it, and one of them is that men are really bound to the Earth by a force which fastens them to it like needles round a spherical lodestone, a theory perfectly outrageous and opposed to all human experience, it follows that unless we can trample upon common sense and ignore the teachings of experience, we have an evident proof that Earth is not a globe. If we could, after our minds had once been opened to the light of truth, conceive of a globular body on the surface of which human beings could exist, the power, no matter by what name it be called, that would hold them on would then necessarily have to be so constraining and cogent that they could not live. The waters of the oceans would have to be a solid mass, for motion would be impossible. But we not only exist, but live and move, and the water of the oceans skips and dances like a thing of life and beauty. This is a proof that the Earth is not a globe." Gerard Hickson said, "Nearly 100 years ago Kepler suggested that some kind of unknown force must hold the Earth and the heavenly bodies in their places, and now Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest mathematician of his age, took up the idea and built the law of gravitation. The name is derived from the Latin word gravis, which means heavy, having weight, while the law of gravitation is defined as that mutual action between masses of matter by virtue of which every such mass tends toward every other with a force varying directly as the product of the masses and inversely as the square of their distances apart. Reduced to simplicity, gravitation is said to be that which attracts everything towards every other thing. That does not tell us much, and yet the little it does tell us is not true, for a thoughtful observer knows very well that everything is not attracted towards every other thing. The definition implies that it is a force, but it does not say so, for that phrase mutual action is ambiguous and not at all convincing. Gabrielle Henriette says, "The system of gravitation which makes the sun the moving center of the universe, the awkward principles of which are anything but certain since they apply to invisible circumstances so that they cannot be checked, is here replaced by the old geocentric system universally accepted until the 17th century, in view, of course, of its undisputable obviousness, and in which the Earth, in a state of immobility and surrounded by the planets visibly moving round it, including the sun, is at the center of our universe. These two facts, which explain almost everything, are firstly the positive existence above the Earth of a solid dome constituting the sky, and secondly the non-material nature of the planets and constellations, which are not physical masses, but merely luminous manifestations without substance. These are the two circumstances which lead today to the fundamental transformation of astronomy." And Professor Bernstein, in his Letters to the British Association, writes, "The theory that motions are produced through material attraction is absurd. Attributing such a power to mere matter, which is passive by nature, is a supreme illusion. It is a lovely and easy theory to satisfy any man's mind, but when the practical test comes, it falls all to pieces and becomes one of the most ridiculous theories."
So there's a rumour going around that the Earth spins on its axis, roughly 360 degrees in 24 hours. There are a number of experiments and demonstrations that can prove this. One such proof is the ability of a spinning gyroscope to remain rigid in space whilst the Earth spins below. The US Navy put out a training video in 1960 explaining this using diagrams, as shown here. The link to the entire video is in the description. Not only is it alleged to remain rigid in space, the angle that the gyroscope, quote-unquote, appears to rotate is said to be measurable using a very simple equation which is wholly dependent on your latitude on Earth and the axial orientation of the gyro. So, through maths, and based on an assumption that a spherical Earth is rotating about its axis, we should be able to predict the angle that the gyroscope will rotate over a given time at a given latitude. This notion has been accepted as fact by modern day science without a shred of evidence to support it. Nowhere can I find any video that demonstrates this apparent proof. I found the same assertion made about apparent drift all over the internet, including on aviation websites like this one, which gives more illustrations and the same equations for calculating the drift. My experiment / demonstration, which is coming up next, will be done using the Super Precision Gyroscope. These are manufactured here in England, and if you haven't guessed by the name, they're works of precision engineering to exacting standards. Here's a video by the manufacturer.
At last, a gyroscope that just works properly, just like you've always wanted. Novel, innovative, and precise. The fascinating properties of gyroscopes, with their ability to maintain position and seemingly gravity-defying properties, will mesmerize both young and old alike. The Super Precision Gyroscope is beautifully designed and manufactured to the highest precision. The gyroscope comes complete with its own electric starter motor. There's no need for string to start it. It's less fiddly, spins the gyro much faster, and doesn't put load to the delicate bearings. Even when spinning at 12,000 revolutions per minute, there is hardly any noise or vibration. And when it's up to full speed, it spins for a very long time. The gimbals are modular, allowing you to construct numerous configurations. You can build the standard setups to demonstrate nutation and precession, plus you can make your own setups to perform your experiments. The parts screw together, as well as 7 places around the gyroscope frame. It will provide hours of amusement and learning by showing just how gyroscopic forces affect our daily lives. Today, they can be found in aircraft, satellites, and many other guidance systems. Made from solid brass, aircraft-grade aluminium, and stainless steel. All of the components are precisely manufactured with state-of-the-art machines. We use some of the most accurate equipment available to detect the slightest imbalance. The brass rotor is dynamically balanced to within a few thousandths of a gram and assembled with ultra-low noise bearings. This meticulous attention to detail produces a true precision instrument that will last for years. The set includes the Super Precision Gyroscope with electric starter motor and gimbals kit, complete with manuals and storage case. Our gyroscope is ideal for schools, universities, or anyone who just enjoys using well-engineered kit. It also makes a great gift for those with inquisitive minds.
Okay, so this is the setup I'm going to be using. You'll notice this side, there's like a blanking insert that goes into the bearing housing on this side. And on this side you attach the motor, so the hole is empty, just with the spindle sticking through. So I quickly realised that when I spun this thing up, due to the presence of material here and the absence of material here, there was a weight imbalance. So I contacted the manufacturer and asked them if this is expected, and they confirmed it was and offered to make me a one-off insert to go in here for free. But they also suggested that what I could do is use some Play-Doh, some kids' plasticine. So I did that, I've got some of my daughter's Play-Doh. Just spun it up to speed with the motor and then inserted this into the hole. That seemed to do the trick. I was able to balance it perfectly. Before I put this in, the extra weight caused this side to drop every time, and if it was over here it would drop this way. So that's how I overcame that. I've attached the whole setup to a protractor which I've blue tacked to the table, and I've blue tacked the actual the frame to the table as well. So this here is the angle that we're looking for. So what we're looking for is this effect. You see how the gyro wants to rotate and stay in the original orientation? Well, that angle that it's rotating, that this bar appears to be rotating over the device, that is the angle that we're looking for. That is the angle that we should be able to calculate this gyroscope moving due to the rotation of the Earth underneath us. So without further ado, let's get on to the test. So I've just attached the motor there. It actually takes 4 AA batteries to power it, and I've run this test quite a number of times now and put quite a few batteries through it, so I kind of know how long they're going to last and what sort of sound comes from the motor, depending on how much power is left in the batteries. And I'd say there's about probably 75% power left in them at the minute, and that's based on 12,000 RPM maximum. That's probably about 8 or 9,000 RPM for this particular test. So it's getting up to speed now. I'm going to remove the motor and replace it with the piece of Play-Doh to get it perfectly balanced. And now I'm going to demonstrate some precession by gently pressing on the horizontal bar there. And now I'm going to line it up as best I can, so that you cannot see the brass flywheel from above, and it's as sort of straight up and down as possible. So if we just take note of where we are now, at you can see a 0 on the top right, just to the right of the bar. You can see a 0 just there, and you'll note that you cannot see the brass flywheel from above now. So we are sort of dead centre above it. So now it's just a waiting game. So while we wait, let's just have a look at a brief history of the gyroscope, up to the point where it was first proposed that it could record the spin of the Earth. So this is just sort of one example that I found on the internet. There are lots and lots of different accounts, and they all differ slightly, but this one seemed like a sort of all-round recount of history. So in early times, people discovered the spinning top, a toy with a unique ability to balance upright while rotating rapidly. Ancient Greek, Chinese and Roman societies built tops for games and entertainment. The Maori in New Zealand have used humming tops with specially crafted holes in mourning ceremonies. In 14th century England, some villages had a large top constructed for a warming up exercise in cold weather. Tops were even used in place of dice. It was not until the late 18th and 19th centuries that scientists and sailors began attempting to use spinning tops as a scientific tool. At the time, sailors relied on sextants for navigation, measuring the angle between specific stars and the horizon. This method was limited, however, if choppy seas or fog obscured the true horizon, or clouds obscured the stars. Serson, an English scientist, noted in the 1740s that the spinning top had a tendency to remain level, even when the surface on which it rested was tilting. He suggested that sailors could use it as an artificial horizon on ships. Unfortunately, when Serson went to sea to test the idea, the ship sank and everyone was lost. A French scientist in the 19th century, Fleury, created a top that was continuously powered by air jets, blowing into mini buckets on the rim of the wheel, a process that had been used for thousands of gyros since. The first modern gyroscope was designed in the early 1800s by Johann Gottlieb Friedrich von Bernberger, a professor at the University of Tübingen in Germany. It was made with a heavy ball instead of a wheel, but since it had no scientific application, it faded into history. In the mid-19th century, the spinning top acquired the name gyroscope, though not through its use as a navigational tool. French scientist Léon Foucault had experimented with a long, heavy pendulum in an attempt to observe the rotation of the Earth. The pendulum was set swinging back and forth along the north-south plane, while the Earth turned beneath it. Foucault corroborated the observation by using a spinning top in a similar manner. He placed a wheel, rotating at high speed, in a supporting ring in such a way that the axis of the spinning wheel could move independently of the ring. In fact, the supporting ring moved over the course of a day, as it was connected to the surface of the rotating Earth. The axis of the wheel remained pointed in its original direction, confirming that the Earth was rotating in a 24-hour period. Foucault named his spinning wheel a gyroscope, from the Greek words gyros, which is revolution, and skopin, which is to see. He had seen the revolution of the Earth with his gyroscope. So, from Wikipedia, Jean-Bernard Léon Foucault, born 18th of September 1819, was a French physicist best known for his demonstration of the Foucault pendulum, a device demonstrating the effect of the Earth's rotation. He also made an early measurement of the speed of light, discovered eddy currents, and is credited with naming the gyroscope, although he did not invent it. Foucault was the son of a publisher in Paris, where he was born. After an education received chiefly at home, he studied medicine, which he had abandoned in favour of physics due to a blood phobia. He first directed his attention to the improvement of Louis Daguerre's photographic processes. For 3 years he was experimental assistant to Alfred Donné in his course of lectures on microscopic anatomy. In 1851 he provided an experimental demonstration of the rotation of Earth on its axis and became well known to the public by Foucault's work. Foucault achieved the demonstration by showing the rotation of the plane of oscillation of a long and heavy pendulum suspended from the roof of the Pantheon in Paris. The experiment caused a sensation in both the learned and popular worlds, and Foucault pendulums were suspended in major cities across Europe and America, attracting large crowds. In the following year, he used and named the gyroscope as conceptually simpler experimental proof. In 1855 he received the Copley Medal of the Royal Society for his very remarkable experimental researches. In 1862 Foucault was made a member of the Bureau de Longitudes and an officer at the Legion of Honour. He became a member of the Royal Society of London in 1864 and a member of the mechanical section of the Institute a year later. He is also credited with determining the speed of light to be 298,000 km per second, which is only 0.6% in error of the currently accepted value, and devising a method of testing the mirror of a reflecting telescope to determine its shape. So, reading between the lines, he was a man of significant academic accomplishment and recognition at the time. One has to wonder then why, when you read the Wikipedia article about Léon Foucault, does it have this one line at the end? Near his death, he returned to Roman Catholicism that he had previously abandoned. Draw your own conclusions. So going back to the test, we've exceeded 6 minutes now and there's no observable movement. You can still see the zero to the right of the bar in its entirety, and you still cannot see the brass flywheel from above. So how much should the gyro have precessed? What angle should the gyro's axis have moved? The calculation is the sine of the latitude times 15 degrees per hour. My current latitude is exactly 53.06 degrees north. So the angle in which the gyro should have moved in 6 minutes is 1.2 degrees. Now this doesn't sound a lot, but let's assume that Léon Foucault's experiments were performed in Paris. He should have seen even less based on his latitude. And let's not forget that he didn't have an electric motor spinning his gyro up to 9,000 RPM. So I'm just going to stop it now. You saw then that there was still plenty of energy left in that flywheel, and it was able to precess when I moved it. So out of sheer curiosity, I decided to fix the motor to the gyro and put a counterweight on the other side, which is slightly heavier than the motor, so I counterweighted the counterweight with more Play-Doh until I got it perfectly balanced, and ran the motor for, I think it was 10 minutes on this one. I'll show you a few minutes of it, but I'm not going to show the whole lot. If anybody wants me to, I can upload the whole video. It's pretty boring, it just does nothing. But this is now the equivalent of, I guess, modern aviation, navigational aviation instruments, you know, with sustained rotation. In Foucault's tests, the rotational velocity would have been continually decreasing. If the batteries are fully charged, I can actually get about 19 minutes of sustained rotation once I've taken the motor off, which is a hell of a lot on this gyroscope. I did actually try putting the motor on and keeping it on and just running it, I think it was for about an hour with a full set of batteries, and still I observed absolutely no movement whatsoever. So it appears that whether you've got the motor on or you've got it up to speed and then taken it off, it doesn't matter, it still doesn't move. So I just cut to 10 minutes. Like I say, if anybody wants me to upload the whole 10 minutes, I will. Or if anybody wants to see me put it through for an hour with the motor on, I'll video that and show you no movement as well. Bearing in mind that after an hour, it should have rotated at about 12 degrees. These are some of the gyros that Leon Foucault used in his experiments. The large one at the back on sort of a wooden tower was a later edition. That one wasn't manufactured until 1867. But the ones at the front were all part of the same setup, and they were demonstrated in 1852, so 15 years earlier. And what you do is you take the flywheel out of the gimbal, the brass gimbal stand on the right, and you place it in this wooden sort of housing and spin it up. Quite how it was spun up isn't clear, couldn't really find that out, but once it's up to speed, they then take it out of this wooden frame and transport it back into the brass gimbal set. Then you see the long pointing arm, the white pointing arm, coming from the sort of axis, the rotational axis there, onto the little measuring stand, which would have had graduations marked on it. And then with the eyeglass, he would look through it and see what the sort of rotation is. So you can see what we're looking at is a very, very tiny amount, and that's due to the fact that he couldn't spin his gyro up for very long back then. Some of the sources I found said it was only between 150 and 200 RPM, which I'm sure doesn't sound right, because I think I could spin that up quicker with a piece of string wrapped around the spindle. But that's what it says. So he wouldn't have had long to actually get this reading before the gyro slowed down to a stop. What, maybe 3-4 minutes? Let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say 5 minutes. So based on a latitude in Paris, that's less than 1 degree's movement in 5 minutes. So you can start to see why he needs the extended arm to sort of exaggerate the angle, and the sort of magnifying telescope looking device, because the movement is extremely small. Now this movement could purely be down to a weight imbalance like I had, or it could be the friction in the bearings. Remember, this was 1852, technology wasn't as it is today. If you remember on the manufacturer's video, they said that there's absolutely no load on these bearings. So whether he was lying about seeing any movement, or whether he did see some movement, but it was just due to the inferior setup he had, I guess we'll never know. Now some of you might be thinking, aircraft directional gyros do actually drift. and this is true. The pilot has to realign the gyro compass with the magnetic compass every 15 minutes. That's good practice, I know that from personal experience. And this is said to happen because of apparent drift. They say it quite clearly in the 1960s US Navy video that I've linked to. They blame this completely on apparent drift. But I'm going to try and simulate what I think is happening, and why pilots have to realign the compass every 15 minutes. So what I've done is I've aligned the vertical peg here with the vertical casing of the gyro there, and I've aligned it, this bar, the bottom bar there, with this foot here, with this third foot. So I'm going to simulate turbulence, vibration from the aircraft, track changes, by just wiggling this bar. So this is only a gradual thing. Every 15 minutes it drifts out slightly, and it varies as well. Sometimes it drifts quicker than other times, and as pilots will be aware, after any sudden or hard banks, or sort of large turns, the compass seems to drift even further and quicker. So let's realign the... No, it's not been doing it for long enough yet. Let's give it a few more. There you can see it's already drifting that way, and it doesn't matter which way. It just depends on the bias of the turn, or the bias of the number of turns in any particular direction. It will tend to drift that way. Now you can see, look, it's gone quite a long way out now. So that's what I think accounts for the corrections that the pilot must make every 15 minutes to realign the gyro compass with the magnetic compass. And what of the artificial horizon? That's a gyro as well. Why doesn't that need resetting every 15 minutes? Surely that would be subject to the exact same drift as the directional gyro. But it's actually considered bad practice to realign your artificial horizon during flight, because you don't know whether you're aligning it to a straight and level orientation. So why does the directional gyro drift, but the artificial horizon gyro doesn't? Well, I believe it's because the directional gyro is 2-axis. So it's allowed to move this way, and it's allowed to move this way, but if it moves this way, the actual flywheel moves with it. In a 3-axis gyro, it can actually move this, the axis can move this way, but the gyro flywheel stays aligned like this. But logically, if the directional gyro precesses due to wanting to remain rigid in space, the artificial horizon gyro would necessarily have to do the same, but it doesn't. So for all the naysayers out there who think I might be somehow deceiving, or I'm doing something wrong, be my guest. Get yourself a gyro and demonstrate it rotating, or appearing to rotate, and to the exact angle, because it should work like clockwork. If you're not willing to do that, then you are just accepting the word of some dude that performed an experiment 164 years ago that you've never witnessed yourself, and nobody else alive today has ever witnessed. After all, it's a really easy experiment. All you need to do is get a perfectly balanced gyroscope, set it running, and wait. You can't really do much wrong. Thanks for watching.
Earth is a level, motionless plane with the sun, moon, and stars revolving over and around us just as you experience every day. The North Pole is the magnetic monopole center point, with Polaris, the North Pole star, situated directly above. Polaris is the only motionless star in the heavens, with all the other constellations revolving perfect circles over the Earth every night. The so-called planets, known to the ancients as wandering stars, were named such because they were observed then, as we can observe today, to wander the heavens, taking their own unique spirograph-like patterns, making both forward and retrograde motions over and around the Earth during their cycles. Meanwhile, the fixed stars were named such because they were observed then, as we can observe today, to stay fixed in their constellation patterns night after night, year after year, century after century, never changing their relative positions. If Earth was truly a tilting, wobbling, spinning space ball, as NASA and modern astronomy proclaim, rotating 1,000 miles per hour on its axis, revolving 67,000 miles per hour around the Sun, spiraling 500,000 miles per hour around the galaxy, and shooting off several million more miles per hour through the universe, the star patterns would never look the same 2 nights in a row, let alone be fixed in exactly the same constellations for thousands upon thousands of years. The reality is that the Earth and Polaris do not move, while everything else in the heavens revolves over Earth and around Polaris, east to west, like in a planetarium dome. Our Earth planetarium, however, is so vast that perspective won't allow any observer to see all the stars simultaneously from any one vantage point. We can see Polaris, Ursa Major and Minor, and other northern constellations from every point north of the equator simultaneously, but conversely cannot see the so-called South Pole Star, Sigma Octantis, the Southern Cross, or other outer constellations simultaneously from every point south of the equator, because they all sweep over a great southern arc from their rise in the evening to their setting in the morning. Facing north, the stars turn counterclockwise from right to left. Facing south, they turn clockwise from left to right. Facing east, they rise in front and set behind, while facing west, they rise behind and set in front. So their apparent motion, angle, and inclination changes depending where you are on Earth and what direction you are facing. But their actual movement is always east to west.